As the sun set, Marcus stood face to face with a man in a crooked uniform. "You're under arrest," the man stammered. But Marcus knew something was wrong. He wasn't being arrested. He was being hunted. What happened next would shock everyone. The truth was darker than anyone imagined. But let's start from the beginning. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the streets of Brooklyn. Marcus had just finished a long day of work and was eager to get home when the screech of tires snapped him back to reality. A car came to an abrupt stop in front of him, the sound of it echoing off the buildings. Before he could process what had just happened, a man in a cheap, ill-fitting uniform stepped out, his fake badge gleaming under the fading light. His movements were erratic, but there was an unsettling confidence in his eyes. "Hey, stop right there!" he barked, voice rough and demanding. Marcus didn't flinch. He had seen men like this before, the ones who pretended to be something they weren't, using intimidation to cover up their own insecurities. This time, though, it was him who had become the target. "Why are you stopping me?" Marcus asked, his voice steady but tinged with confusion. The fake cop's hand hovered near his holstered gun, and for a moment, Marcus could feel the heat of the tension between them. The man was trying too hard to sound official, but his shaky hands betrayed him. His eyes weren't just filled with arrogance. There was something else in them. Fear, unease. "I'm placing you under arrest for loitering," the man finally said, his words coming out a little too quickly. Marcus's brow furrowed. Loitering? He was just walking home. There was no reason for this. The air around them seemed to thicken with every passing second, the streets now unnervingly silent. Before Marcus could respond, the man shoved him toward the car. Marcus staggered but didn't fall, his instincts warning him that this was wrong. His heart raced, but he held his ground. This wasn't just a case of someone trying to pull rank. There was something darker at play, something he couldn't yet put his finger on. Every fiber in his being screamed to resist, to fight back, but he didn't want to escalate things. And yet, the injustice of it all burned in his chest. This wasn't about loitering. It was something much worse. The fake cop's hand gripped Marcus's arm with a vice-like force, pulling him towards the car as he fumbled for his cuffs. "You're coming with me," the man growled, his voice laced with thinly veiled anger. Marcus's mind raced, adrenaline flooding his veins. The situation was spiraling out of control, and the weight of confusion pressed down on him. What was happening? His instincts screamed for him to fight back, but he forced himself to stay calm. His heart pounded in his chest as he tried to make sense of it all. This wasn't a typical confrontation. This was something else entirely. Marcus had seen power struggles before, but this felt different, darker, more personal. The fake cop wasn't just playing a role. He was trying to make Marcus his target. "Who are you really?" Marcus demanded, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. His gaze never left the man's face. It wasn't just a question. It was a challenge. A moment of clarity passed between them. The man's mask of authority faltered for an instant, his grip loosening just slightly. The fake cop's eyes darkened, his fear palpable. "You don't get to question me, criminal," he snapped, his voice cracking under the weight of his own bravado. But Marcus saw it in his hands, shaking now, his fingers unsteady as they clutched the cuffs. The gun at his side hung loosely, more of a threat to him than to Marcus. It was all a facade, a bluff he couldn't back up. The air around them seemed to hum with tension as the crowd began to notice. Murmurs of confusion and disbelief rippled through the onlookers. People were starting to gather, eyes flicking between Marcus and the man in the uniform. The heat of the moment was spreading, and Marcus felt it too. A sense that this was bigger than just a random altercation. Something was brewing beneath the surface. Marcus's mind raced, calculating his next move. The real cops would be here soon, and this situation would go from bad to worse in an instant. He had to act quickly. Every second counted. The fake cop's grip tightened again, but this time, Marcus was ready. The next few moments could change everything. As the fake cop's grip tightened, Marcus felt the surge of urgency. His mind raced for a solution. Without hesitation, he used his size to his advantage, planting his feet firmly on the ground before he shoved the man back with a sudden burst of force. The crowd gasped in shock. The fake cop stumbled, momentarily disoriented. It was the opening Marcus needed. In a swift motion, he spun around, his arm sweeping out to knock the man's gun from its holster. The weapon hit the ground with a sharp clatter, and Marcus felt a rush of adrenaline. For the first time in this whole surreal ordeal, he had control. "Get back, or I'll call for backup," the fake cop shouted, his voice now shaking, losing the edge it once had. Marcus could see the desperation in his eyes, the cracks in his facade. This man wasn't a cop. This was a desperate man with something to hide. And Marcus wasn't about to let fear control him. The crowd, now fully aware of the deception, began to murmur louder. "That's not a cop!" someone shouted, their voice cutting through the tension. Another voice joined in. "Call 911!" Phones clicked on, their screens illuminating the darkening street as people began recording the scene. The air was thick with disbelief and fear, but also with a strange sense of empowerment. The truth was spilling out in real time. Seconds later, the sound of sirens approached, and the real officers arrived. Marcus could feel his chest tighten, but he stood his ground. He knew the moment the officers saw the fake cop, they would see through the lie. And that's exactly what happened. One officer, Sergeant Taylor, stepped forward, her eyes locking on the man in the ill-fitting uniform. "Brian?" she called, disbelief lacing her voice. She took another step closer, her gaze intense. "What the hell are you doing?" The fake cop froze. The name hit Marcus like a hammer. Brian. He knew the name now. This man wasn't just some random impersonator. He was someone from the precinct, someone who had been fired months ago, someone who was never supposed to put on a uniform again. The truth came crashing down, and Marcus could feel the weight of it, heavy and undeniable. The crowd fell silent, watching as the lie unraveled before their eyes. Marcus, bruised and shaken, stood tall as the real officers arrested Brian, the man who had tried to detain him without cause. The crowd erupted into murmurs of disbelief, some in shock, others in a quiet sense of justice being served. As the handcuffs clicked around Brian's wrists, Marcus couldn't help but feel a surge of relief, a feeling that had been absent for far too long. The system had failed him, but it wasn't too late to make things right. "Thank you," Sergeant Taylor said quietly to Marcus, her voice filled with regret. "We'll make sure this gets reported." Marcus nodded. "Just do what's right," he replied, his voice steady. For once, the weight of injustice wasn't so heavy. As Brian was led away, Marcus glanced at the crowd that had gathered. They had witnessed the truth unfold, and for a brief moment, the world felt like it was just a little bit better. The justice he had longed for was finally within reach.